Greater than, she stood there on one leg, holding a tray with trembling hands, and asked a single dad a question that would shatter both their lives forever. "Can I share this table?" What he said next didn't just change her fate, it exposed a secret buried for years, one that would bring powerful people to their knees. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are. On a grey afternoon in a small roadside cafe just outside Manchester, where rain streaked the windows like unfinished thoughts and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with cheap soup, Daniel Harper sat hunched at a corner table meant for four, though he occupied only one chair in a lifetime of exhaustion, his jacket draped over the back of the chair beside him because the other seat was reserved for his daughter Emma's school bag, a faded blue thing patched twice at the seams, and his eyes kept flicking to the clock because he had exactly 37 minutes before he had to pick her up from after-school care or face another warning note he couldn't afford to ignore, and he was halfway through a sandwich he didn't taste when the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way gravity changes when something fragile enters your orbit, because that was when she appeared, standing just inside the cafe doorway, one leg steady, the other ending above the knee, balanced expertly on a worn prosthetic that had seen better days, her coat too thin for the weather, her dark hair pulled back with a cracked plastic clip, holding a tray with a cup of tea and a plate of toast that looked like it had been chosen because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, and she scanned the room with a practiced hesitation that told Daniel she was used to calculating rejection before it happened, used to measuring spaces not for comfort but for safety, and when her eyes met his, she flinched almost imperceptibly before forcing herself forward, step by careful step, until she stopped at his table, her voice quiet but steady as she said, "Can I share this table?" And Daniel looked up, startled, because there were empty seats elsewhere, because people usually avoided his table, because he looked tired and broken and visible, and for half a second he saw the flicker of something he recognized too well in her eyes, that rehearsed readiness to be told no, and something inside him tightened, because he remembered being the one standing with a child in his arms and nowhere to sit, and without thinking, without weighing consequences, he said the words that would ripple through both their lives like a stone dropped into deep water. "You don't have to ask," he said, sliding Emma's bag to the floor and pulling out the chair. "This table's yours too," and she froze, as if unused to generosity without conditions, then nodded once and sat carefully, thanking him in a voice that carried more relief than the word itself, and for a few minutes they ate in silence broken only by the rain and the clink of cutlery, until Emma's name came up accidentally, until the girl, Lily, she said, smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes, until Daniel noticed how her hands shook slightly when she lifted the cup, until the waitress glanced over with thinly veiled irritation, and until Daniel, trying to lighten the moment, said, "My daughter would have loved that toast," and Lily went still, completely still, her fingers tightening around the mug, her breathing changing just enough that Daniel noticed, and when she finally looked at him again, there was something unresolved, as she said softly, "I used to come here with my dad too, before everything," and Daniel didn't know it yet, but that sentence was the first crack in a wall that powerful people had spent years building, a wall that hid hospital records, forged accident reports, hush money, and the truth about a fire that never should have happened, a fire that took Lily's leg, her father's life, and unknowingly bound her future to the single dad now sitting across from her. A man who would soon be forced to choose between staying invisible and standing up against a system designed to crush people like them, because as the clock ticked and the rain fell harder, Lily reached into her bag, pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft with age, and asked a question that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Do you work at St. Mary's Hospital, or did you 5 years ago?" Daniel felt the air leave his lungs when Lily asked that question, not because he didn't expect his past to surface someday but because it had followed him like a shadow he'd learned to ignore. And for a moment the cafe blurred as memories surged back uninvited. Fluorescent hospital lights, the antiseptic smell that never quite washed off his skin, the sound of alarms screaming while administrators whispered about liability, and he swallowed hard before nodding slowly, saying yes, he had worked at St. Mary's, 5 years ago exactly, before budget cuts and restructuring had turned good nurses into expendable numbers, and Lily's face tightened in a way that made him realize this conversation was no coincidence at all. Because she reached into her bag again, slower this time, pulling out a thin folder wrapped in plastic, the kind people use to protect documents they can't afford to lose, and she slid it across the table with a hand that shook no longer, as if whatever fear she'd been carrying had finally hardened into resolve, and Daniel opened it reluctantly, his heart thudding louder with each page, because inside were photocopies of medical forms, incident reports, a grainy photo of a burned ward, and at the center of it all a name he had not spoken aloud in years, Thomas Reed. And when Lily said, "That was my father," Daniel felt a sick recognition settle into his bones, because Thomas Reed hadn't been just another patient. He'd been the man trapped in Ward C the night the oxygen line exploded, the man Daniel had tried to pull free while smoke swallowed the corridor, the man who had begged him to save his daughter first even though she wasn't there, even though Daniel had known, even then, that something was very wrong about that fire, that alarms had failed, that doors had locked when they shouldn't have, and that afterward the hospital's version of events had been written before anyone asked questions, and Lily leaned closer now, lowering her voice as the waitress passed, explaining that she hadn't lost her leg in the fire itself but during the chaos afterward, when a delayed evacuation and a collapsing stairwell crushed her beneath falling debris while executives were already drafting press statements, and Daniel's hands clenched around the papers as guilt surged through him. Guilt for surviving, for leaving, for choosing Emma over fighting a system that had already labeled him a troublemaker, and Lily watched his face carefully, as if searching for confirmation of something she already suspected, before telling him she had spent years collecting evidence, years being dismissed as an angry disabled girl chasing ghosts, years being told the settlement her family received was generous, even though it barely covered prosthetics and therapy, and that every time she got close to the truth, doors closed, files disappeared, witnesses recanted, until she realized she needed someone from inside, someone who had been there that night and walked away, and Daniel whispered that he had tried to report what he saw, that he'd been warned, quietly but clearly, that pushing further would cost him his job and his child's future, and Lily nodded as if she'd expected nothing less, because she revealed then that Street Mary's wasn't just negligent, it was protected, shielded by investors, donors, and a board whose names appeared on political campaigns and charity galas, and the fire had been caused not by accident but by a cost-cutting decision to ignore a faulty oxygen valve flagged weeks earlier, a decision signed off by a man who now sat on the National Health Oversight Committee, and Daniel felt anger rise where fear had lived for years, a slow-burning fury that made his voice shake as he asked why she had approached him here, today, of all places, and Lily's answer landed like a final twist of the knife. Because she had followed him, quietly, for months, because she knew he was a single dad barely scraping by, because she knew he still volunteered at the free clinic on weekends, because she knew he hadn't sold his silence, and because tomorrow the hospital board was scheduled to destroy the remaining physical records under the guise of archival clearance, and as she said this, the cafe door opened and a man in a tailored coat stepped inside, scanning the room too deliberately, and Lily stiffened, whispering that she thought she'd been followed, and Daniel realized with sudden clarity that the kindness of sharing a table had just pulled him and his daughter into a fight that powerful people would do anything to keep buried, because the man's gaze locked onto them, his jaw tightening as he spoke quietly into his phone, and Daniel knew then that there was no going back, not after this, not after the truth had finally found him again. Daniel didn't wait to see what the man by the door would do because instinct, sharpened by years of night shifts and emergency alarms, kicked in, and he calmly folded the documents back into Lily's folder, slid it into his jacket, and stood, placing himself between her and the stranger as if his body remembered how to shield someone else's life even when his own was fraying, and he told Lily it was time to leave, that Emma would be waiting, that whatever happened next had to happen in the open, not in a cafe where silence could be bought, and as they stepped into the rain the man followed, confirming Lily's fear, but Daniel didn't run, instead he turned, met the man's eyes, and said loudly enough for passers-by to hear, "If you're here about Street Mary's, you're already too late," and something in the man's face shifted, because bluff or not, exposure was the one thing his employers feared, and Daniel used that moment to usher Lily into a taxi, memorizing the license plate just in case, and over the next 24 hours their lives accelerated into something neither had planned for, because Daniel picked up Emma, explained only that they were helping a friend, and spent the night scanning documents, recording a sworn statement on his phone, and contacting an investigative journalist he once knew from a patient advocacy event, a woman who still believed the truth mattered, and when the story broke the next morning it did not whisper. It detonated, with headlines naming the fire, the ignored safety reports, the destroyed records, and the connection to officials who had built careers on clean reputations, and the hospital board issued denials that unraveled within hours as more whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by seeing someone finally stand, and Lily watched from Daniel's small living room as her father's name trended not as a footnote but as a symbol of what had been stolen, and when legal action followed, Daniel expected retaliation, expected to lose what little he had, but instead found something unexpected: protection, because public attention became armor, because silence was no longer an option for those in power, and months later, as court cases moved forward and compensation funds were established, Lily stood unaided for the first time with a new prosthetic paid for by a justice fund created in her father's name, And Daniel, offered his old job back, declined, choosing instead to lead patient safety advocacy full-time, because Emma deserved a father who didn't look away anymore. And on the anniversary of the fire they returned to the same cafe, sunlight replacing rain, the same table waiting, and Lily smiled as she asked, almost playfully, "Mind if I share this table again?" And Daniel laughed softly, answering, "You never had to ask," knowing that one small act of kindness had cracked open a truth powerful enough to change lives, including his own, because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't to stand alone, it's to make room.